Hello, and welcome to our podcast series, Conversations with KidsPeace. I'm Bob Martin. The latest issue of KidsPeace's flagship publication, Healing Magazine, has been published electronically at healingmagazine.org. The issue focuses on ways that medical care and mental health are intersecting as the stigma surrounding mental health treatment for children fades. When we decided to focus on this subject, we were lucky enough to find out about someone who has been talking about this with a podcast audience for several years. Dr. Lia Gaggino is a board-certified primary care pediatrician who also hosts the podcast Pediatric Meltdown, which over its 250 episodes so far has explored this intersection of physical and mental health care. We feature a Q&A article with Dr. Gaggino in the spring-summer 2025 edition of Healing, and she was kind enough also to join us for our podcast. Here's our conversation. Dr. Gaggino, welcome to the Conversations podcast, and thanks again for sharing your thoughts with us in the latest issue of Healing Magazine. I want to start by urging everybody to, first of all, go to healingmagazine.org to read our Q&A article. But for the podcast, I wonder if we could take this a little bit further. One thing I was really interested in was in the Q&A, you mentioned a state of Michigan initiative from 2012 called MC3. You termed it a game changer in terms of the intersection of pediatric care and mental health. What is MC3 for a layman audience, and why do you think it's so important?
Sure. Well, MC3 is one of 49 programs, and it is called a Child Psychiatry Access Program. So MC3 was one of the earliest. I believe the one in Massachusetts, which is also known as MCPAP, was the first. And basically, there was an awareness that there just weren't enough child psychiatrists. And, pediatricians were kind of winging it and doing our best. And then this idea developed to have child psychiatrists be available for consultation. Sometimes we call these things curbside consults. Basically, I can call, I would call your cardiologist and say, hey, I've got a patient with high blood pressure, and I was wondering what I should start with, that kind of thing. But we just didn't have anything like that in child psychiatry, and there's just not enough child psychiatrists, and there's not going to be. So it was a way to kind of leverage the workforce that there is. And every state's program's a little bit different. Most of these are funded through the government. So I'm not sure what that's going to look like going forward, but hopefully they'll continue. Many states also fund these. So HRSA is the funder for many programs. But essentially, I call and I talk to one of my colleagues at MC3 on the phone and just say, hey, I've got a kid. They have some anxiety. I've tried Prozac, and I'm wondering about some side effects. Should I try something else? And they basically just kind of talk me through it. And it can be a really simple question, or it can be super complex. And I think the child psychiatrists were very surprised at how complex the issues were. I think they were imagining we were going to be calling about pretty straightforward stuff, but that wasn't the case. So it really honestly changed my prescribing. There were a lot of medications that I was using that were more likely to have some side effects that I probably could have avoided, or it was okay to wean them. So having that guidance was immensely helpful. And as I mentioned, I believe every state except Idaho has a program.
Is that right? Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and if your listeners want to find, like, where's mine?
Yeah,
it's nncpap.org/map. And that shows people. For parents who might be listening, I think it's perfectly fine to say, hey, I was listening to this podcast and I heard that there are child psychiatrists that can, talk people through stuff. And, is that something that you knew about that kind of thing. And I mean, I wouldn't be insulted if, to say, sure, I could check that out, or I didn't know, because some people may not.
Well, and we've talked a lot on the podcast here about access sort of at the beginning of the process for families who may be dealing with crisis, and how important it is for them to get good information up front rather than kind of wander through a whole bunch of bureaucratic and bureaucratic situations and falling through the cracks and everything. And then, as with anything having to do with health, the longer you wait to address it, the harsher the condition gets, and the narrowing of the options that are available to you happens. And
well, especially if you're looking for something like right now. The other thing that I would recommend for families is it's called the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So ACAP, AACAP. There's a link to, it's called Facts for Families, and it's like, what's anxiety, what's depression, what's OCD, medication question. It's really, really well done. So that is freely accessible.
fabulous. You started the Pediatric Meltdown podcast in 2020, and just before we started our recording, you had some news that was a little bittersweet. So maybe we should start with that. What's happening?
Yeah. So, when I started the podcast, it was in August of 2020. It was at the early part of the pandemic. And honestly, it was my social life. And the background's blurred, but I'm sitting in a 4x4 closet. And this is where I met with my friends. And, it just sort of morphed over time. And, anytime I would hear someone talk about something that was interesting, I'd be like, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And it became much more.
What that's like. People here know that they hear the same thing from me.
So. Yeah, I'm always looking for a guest. So, just life kind of happens. So here I am. It is now almost 5 years later, and I have an 18-month-old grandson. My husband's having some medical problems. I've got my mother who's going to be 93, and I'm just kind of in this life space to try and let go of some things. And I read this great book called From Strength to Strength, and it's about sort of your second part of your life and how to go from striving to kind of letting go. And so I made the hard decision to end the podcast with the June 11th episode, which will be number 250. And it's kind of, I don't know, sometimes things are just like cosmic. I ran into this woman at a meeting, and they have a program called Hand in Hand Parenting, and it's about parenting support. And you can go to handinhandparenting.org. And I have this thing about hands. For me, they have been a symbol that's been very meaningful to me since the time I was a teenager. And now I think of it as healing hands. So somehow this hand in hand, I got an email from her serendipitously. Anyway, so we did this podcast, and that was my final one, talking about kind of relational health and the things that I think are important, which honestly go way beyond writing prescriptions. So, but the podcast will be out on the airwaves, and there's lots and lots of really good topics. So they're out there, but I'm going to at least take a break. My podcast producer said, I'm not sure this will be your last, but for the time being.
You never say never. That's
exact.
That's
well, and I am contemplating, do I want to do something like a blog or Substack or something like that? Just to keep my hand in. But, as you know, podcasting takes a lot of time and funding to do this. So it's an expensive hobby.
Well, you do it so well.
Aw, thanks.
The episodes are great. I was wondering if you had to, if you were put on the spot and say, what's one lesson you'd like to see pediatric practitioners take away from the discussions you've had on pediatric meltdown? What would that be?
Listen.
Yes.
Honestly, listen to families, and sit down and listen, because the act of sitting down, the message on the other end is that you have time for them. And even if you only sit down for a couple minutes, people think it's longer. But the I'm going out the door and I've got my hand on the knob, and somebody asked me a question and I'm kind of half in it. People really want us to be with them. And that begins the relationship of healing, as far as I'm concerned. So that would be my biggest takeaway: is what does this family want? What do they need? What's important to them? How are they doing?
Listening to them and taking their cues. That is very important. Not just in the therapeutic space, it's important in everything in life. You mentioned in the article that you felt it was really important that you made the decision to have included social workers in your practice. Why do you feel that was a key step?
Well, that was another game changer, is that I was really struggling because I liked doing mental health work. I had a lot of patients that wanted to see me, which was awesome, but it takes a lot of time, and emotionally it can be kind of overwhelming to do that. And but the time thing is often difficult for us. And so I started out in desperation. I reached out to our university, and I actually had master's level child psychologists who were working on their PhDs start with me, and we did an external practicum. So kind of got a feel for what that was like. And then our system invested in hiring social workers. And at first they didn't know what they were supposed to do. We didn't know. But over time, it got to be one of these things where if I was talking to a patient and, they were suicidal, I could say, you know what, I'm going to have one of my team, Deborah, come on in and visit with you a little bit and get a little bit more information. And I could hand it off, and they could do the intake, the assessment. Then we would sort of circle back. But during that time that the social worker was in there, then I could be seeing my other patients that were waiting. And it just, and I think the patients then saw the social worker as an extension of me, not like I have to go to a therapist someplace else. Right. And so it's very effective. And I think it's becoming much more available, although, people in private practice or rural areas, this may be more difficult funding wise if you're not affiliated with a system. But I think it's doable. And if you have a university nearby, check them out to see if they have social work programs or psychology programs that you can tap.
Yeah. And again, as you achieve sort of this knowledge, this base of experience, it just makes it all the more possible for people to say, this has been tried and it's been working. Let's give it a shot and adjust it for what our situation is, but be able to give it a shot, as opposed to taking on something that is sort of out of the blue and nobody's tried before,
Well, and the other thing that they could offer are what are called brief interventions. So it's not true therapy, but it might be 5 or 6 sessions that are maybe 20, 30 minutes. And it could just be pinpointing, certain things like school avoidance. Let's talk about, some strategies to get you back to school. And it may not necessarily be a deep thing that needs in-depth therapy, or even if that is needed, it can be a bridge until they're able to get in to see somebody. Mm-hmm. So that's the other nice thing. But it can be simple things like temper tantrums and, just sort of heading off at the beginning when things are a worry.
Right. Have you ever received a response from a podcast listener now that you've been doing this for 5 years that you think of and it truly surprised you?
I wish I could say I got lots of responses, but I don't know. People are funny about what they respond. Um, I don't think really. I did have one of my podcast fans at the beginning. I had posted, I was doing my own social media and I was posted a picture of a little girl who was running in the water and she had on, they're called puddle jumpers. They're little inflatable swimmies that go on your arm.
Right.
And she just was like, you know, that's not safe for drowning prevention. It's not the same as a life jacket. So I took that to heart and I took it down and I wrote on there. I said, "Hey, this was brought to my attention." So yeah, that was kind of a call out, and I was able to do some education. So
You
that was
know,
probably. I'm more often it was people saying, you know, yes, I can relate to this, that kind of thing.
yeah, I'm sure you got a lot of folks who were saying, "Wow, this is really where I am, what I'm doing, my thinking." And so uh, I'm sure they will be, um, saddened at your stepping away, and hopefully that your podcast producer is right, and you'll be back.
Well, I do have one other podcast to recommend people to.
Oh, good.
One of my child and adolescent psychology colleagues, Elise Faluco, has a podcast called Child Mental Health. It used to be called Psyched for Peds, which was the most clever name, but it was PSYCH, capital ED, and the number 4 and peds. And it was not searchable. So she made it simple, and it's Child Mental Health. And they are great short episodes. She does a wonderful job. So if listeners want that kind of content, that she's a good resource.
URLs are often, the bane of poetic expression, I think.
Well,
You look at
pediatric
and especially
pediatric
when you get one,
meltdown.
and you're like, if you divide that word somewhere else, you're going someplace you don't want to be. So that
Right.
happens.
Well, Pediatric Meltdown is probably not searchable, but I love the title so much that I just kept it.
Well,
So,
it's great, and everything about it has been wonderful.
thank you.
When we have our discussions, we end by asking our guests for a life hack. Now, this can be a favorite saying, word of wisdom. Maybe it's a tip to do something around the house a little better. So, Dr. Gino, what's your life hack for us today?
Ooh, I know you posed that question to me for me to think about, then I forgot to think about it.
That happens more often than you think on this show.
I think honestly, for me, the best lesson has been something I've learned from my grandson, and that is, be in the moment, because that's all we've got. My mother kind of confirms that because she's got some memory loss, so she doesn't really remember about the past, and she doesn't really care about the future. She's like, why would I care? So, and my grandson helps remember to, see what he sees, because it's all new to him.
Mhm.
Looking at the leaves and the wind and animals, and and when I'm with him, I can't use my phone. I can't do anything other than be with him. And that has been one of the biggest gifts I've had. And I love that. So you don't have to wait until you're a grandparent to do that. You can start anytime.
Well, it is something in this interconnected age we live in, with all the devices, all the screens, all the calls upon our time. The making sure we retain the skills to disconnect and to understand what's happening at the beginning is an underrated skill, frankly. And I'm glad you mentioned it. So.
I think the other thing that I've taken away from doing the podcast is that, when we talk about trauma response, it's fight, flight, or freeze, but the fourth one is called affiliate. And that's basically, being with each other. And, in practicing medicine, again, it is about relationships with each other. Because if you don't have relationship and trust, if I say, gee, I think that this vaccine's really important, if you trust me, you're much more likely to take my advice rather than all the misinformation that's out there.
Right.
On that note, just one other resource for families, healthychildren.org is the American Academy of Pediatrics website for parents. There's also a podcast, and any question you have about child health, it could be from car seats to hand, foot, and mouth to child anxiety. It's there, and it's amazing. So before you feel like you need to, Google Doc, check out healthychildren.org.
We'll make sure to get those links on our blog.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Lia Gaggino is a pediatrician and I only say this because I love to say the name, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and has been the host of the Pediatric Meltdown podcast. It is new episodes are coming to a close, or by the time you see this, they may have come to a close, but you can access all of the 250 episodes at pediatricmeltdown.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Dr. Gaggino, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the airtime, and being with families, being a pediatrician has been the best job ever. I'd do it over in a heartbeat.
Wonderful. And thank you all for joining us as well. We look forward to having you join us again for more conversations with KidsPeace. And until then, take care.